Everybody. I'm Liz Hoddle, the Director of Events and Marketing at Politics and Prose, and I'm so pleased to welcome Laila Lalami for her very first event for her striking new book, Conditional Citizens, on Belonging in America, in conversation with artist, writer, and illustrator, Molly Crabapple. At any time, you can ask a question down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go through as many questions as we can. This is a safe space for conversation and creativity, and only respect is welcome here. But we are open to great, complicated, juicy questions, so please come ahead. You can also click on the link in the chat to purchase Conditional Citizens on PNP's website. Please remember that these book sales enable us to continue to bring you the programming that we are so proud of, and we desperately need the sales to sustain us. So please do just buy a book tonight. I first became aware of Conditional Citizens in one of those bookseller, editor kind of meet and greets where Errol McDonald, Laila's editor, said he thought it was one of the most important books he'd ever worked on. Every editor kind of always says that, but this is always, but this is the man who's edited Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and so many others. And when he talks, you listen. And he was correct. Crucial, complex truth-telling has defined Laila's work as the author of 4 award-winning novels, including Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits, Secret Son, The Moor's Account, and The Other Americans. Though she's an accomplished essayist, Conditional Citizens is her first full-length work of nonfiction. Molly Crabapple is an artist and writer who brings her singular eye and voice and her commitment to resistance to many different mediums. She is the author of 2 books, Children of the Gun, a memoir of the Syrian war, and Drawing Blood. And when I was doing research, I also noticed that she was nominated for an Emmy last night, which hopefully she will tell us a little bit more about. Please help me welcome Laila and Molly to Politics and Prose Live.
Oh my God, I am so honored to be here, and thank you so much for that generous introduction. I first met Laila when we were doing a discussion of my first book at the last bookstore in LA many years ago, and it's with great pleasure that I get to speak to her again, though I very much wish that it was in person and we weren't just confined in our Zoom boxes. This book, Conditional Citizens, is, well, what can I say? It's an astounding book that explores questions of identity, of belonging, of what American citizenship means, of the walls that we draw between countries and between each other, with incredible empathy, with compassion, and with just like iron intellectual rigor. And I second all recommendations that you buy it. The way tonight is going to go is first Laila is going to read a page from her book, and then me and her are going to discuss her work, and then we'll have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So without further ado, I'd love to invite you, Laila, to read from your work.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's such a thrill to see your face. I wish it was in person, and it's really an honor to be in conversation with you about this book. I'm sure that we'll have much to talk about. I'm going to read from the opening chapter, and I'll read just 1 page just to give people a sense of what the prose sounds like, and then we can talk about the content. This is a story about love and country, and I will tell it to you how I remember it, in strands that took me years to untangle and then thread together. I became an American on a sweltering day in 2000, a day when the marine layer over Los Angeles cleared off before breakfast. The exact date had been circled on my wall calendar with the same blue Sharpie I used to mark holidays, and I thought of it as an equally festive occasion, the culmination of a journey that had begun when I came to the United States as a foreign student 8 years earlier. Over the course of those years, I had adopted, almost without realizing it, 2 of the more emblematic trappings of that particular era. I worked for a technology startup company, and I drove an SUV for which I had no discernible need. The deregulation of banks, the war in the Balkans, and Bill Clinton's angry denials that he did not have sex with that woman were in the past. The NASDAQ was at a record high, unemployment was at a record low. The future seemed full of possibility. The citizenship ceremony was held at the Pomona Fairplex, a 487-acre facility best known for hosting the Los Angeles County Fair every summer. I remember wearing a sleeveless dress, a silver necklace my mother had given me, and a pair of new shoes that blistered my feet. My husband was in the same black suit and tie he had worn at our wedding. Ushers directed us to Building 4, a large gray hall where I turned in my alien registration card and was handed a miniature flag in return. So I'll stop right there, just to give you an idea of what it sounds like, the little miniature flag.
I suppose that we should start by discussing how this book came about. Can you tell me like what moved you to create Conditional Citizens, which is, I think, your first work of nonfiction, and what was the process of making it?
So I started thinking about this back in 2015, and started thinking a lot about my experience as a naturalized citizen and as an immigrant and as a woman, as an Arab and a Muslim in the United States. And I had been noticing how certain Muslims were kind of praised and platformed in the media when they agreed with US foreign policy, and conversely ignored or outright attacked when they didn't. And it was something that I had noticed for a while. And then came the Democratic National Convention in 2016, when a gentleman by the name of Khizr Khan came and spoke on stage with his wife Ghazala about their son, who was a captain in the United States Army. And there was that moment when he pulled out his copy of the Constitution. It was such an electrifying moment. And then immediately after that, he was attacked by the opposing candidate as a sympathizer of the Muslim Brotherhood, that, his son was said to be a stealth jihadist. I mean, it was just extremely ugly. And it was just staggering to see that reaction, because the moment that I saw him on stage and I saw what he was there to essentially advocate for a woman who voted for the war in which his son has died, and his son had made this ultimate sacrifice, and still that wasn't enough. And the opposing side attacked the family. And I wrote a very short piece for The Nation called Conditional Citizens, and it was about that moment, and kind of tied to basically this experience of any time a Muslim American gains some kind of prominence in the political arena, these accusations usually follow. And we have seen this with Ilhan Omar, for example. And so it was just meant to be that column, and I started thinking about it, and the idea of kind of developing this into a larger work of nonfiction came about. And so at that, I was about to finish working on The Other Americans, which was my previous novels. And when I was done with that, I promised myself I would just sit down and write the whole thing. And so I started thinking about it and writing shorter pieces. And then when I was done with the novel, I sat down to work on this one. And as I began to work on it, it occurred to me, the longer I looked at the experience, at my experience as a Muslim American, but also at the larger experience of Muslim Americans in this country, the harder it became to isolate it from the way in which other communities had been treated at different moments in American history. So almost anything in the way in which they have been treated, or Muslim Americans have been treated, can be tied to the way another community had been treated before them. And so then in the book, I decided to sort of broaden my scope, and instead of it being just about Muslim Americans or Arab Americans, I do certainly talk about these things, but I also try and tie it to the experiences of other marginalized groups, whether it is women or the LGBT community, or people of Latin origin. So any way in which I could draw connections to those experiences, I tried to include that in the book. And so that's why the book is called Conditional Citizens.
And one of the theses of the book is that originally American citizenship, it was basically just for white property owning Protestant men, and that every other group of people has faced challenges to the ideas that they could be citizens, right? whether it was, Chinese immigrants facing the Chinese Exclusion Act, whether it was, Jewish or Irish or Italian immigrants, whether it was Muslim immigrants who see their loyalty constantly questioned, or whether it was the descendants of enslaved Africans and indigenous people who suffered unimaginable violence and, on whose bodies really the American project has been built. Can you talk a little bit more about what conditional citizens means to you?
Right. So when I started thinking about this idea about citizenship, because I really did want to reflect about that, because citizenship is entirely outside of our control. We do not choose where we are born. So the citizenship that you hold is entirely random. And the only people who actually get to choose to be citizens are naturalized citizens. So somebody like me that, actually chose to be a citizen. And what's striking about it in the United States is that the system was designed by the founders, right? Who, for the vast majority of them, were white slave-owning men. And so when the laws were originally written about, the laws that delineated who gets to be American and who's not, like who belongs within the definition of American, in 1790, that was limited to free white persons. So white men and women, and certain rights that normally flow from citizenship, like the right to vote, were restricted to propertied white men, basically rich white dudes. And and so over the next, as you said, over the next centuries and through this very bloody struggle, those boundaries were stretched to include other people that were on this land, including the original peoples that inhabited this land, who did not become United States citizens until 1924. And so when I look at citizenship today, it's impossible for me to look at it the way in which the Constitution defines it, which is as just this thing that protects everyone equally, regardless of your origin or your religion or your gender. The Constitution is supposed to protect you equally. But in reality, not everybody is an equal citizen. And some people are citizens if, you're a citizen if you don't, for example, criticize police brutality, for example. So you can be an extremely successful athlete and everybody admires you and loves you. But if you take a knee in order to protest police brutality, suddenly you are a traitor, right? And that is one of the labels that was used against Colin Kaepernick, traitor. So I think that the concept of conditional citizenship is this sense where you are a citizen, so you're embraced with one arm, but you're rejected with the other at the first opportunity. And typically that opportunity is when you are demanding justice and equality for everyone. And that's when that sort of rejection comes about. So I gave the example of Colin Kaepernick, but there are so many examples, as I'm sure you know, of people like that, in entire communities like that that are ostracized and do not have access to equal citizenship.
This ties in with the question of assimilation, which is something that you wrote about with really incredible nuance and subtlety. Immigrants in America face the demand to assimilate, especially if they're immigrants that don't look white. However, the demand to assimilate has never been something that's applied equally to all immigrants everywhere. You bring up a teacher that you really loved when you were young, Olga Braun, who was a French woman and who had lived in Morocco, many, many years, did not speak Arabic. She dressed like a French woman. She, taught in French, and that was okay. And the reason that that was okay was because France had colonized Morocco. And so someone who is French was just assumed to have, come from a superior culture and they don't have to assimilate. Whereas if a Moroccan was in France, the power dynamic would be totally different, and that Moroccan would face immediate demands to assimilate to the French ways of doing things. You also talk a lot about the loss that assimilation implies, right? Because I mean, I think this is something that many second generation, immigrants, or many children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants in America struggle with a lot. Like, what did they lose, right? What did they leave behind? Did they leave behind their language? Did they leave behind certain traditions? Did they change their name so they can sound more white? One of my friends, his parents were Chinese immigrants, and they changed their name to Louis, like an Italian guy to be easier to pronounce, Like, what do you lose? What do you lose by assimilating? So tell me more about assimilation and what that looks like in America, like what that means to you, and like kind of complicate that notion a bit for us.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because there's never really been any definition of what assimilation really means. I think when you look at American history, the most striking example of an effort to assimilate a particular community is what has happened with indigenous people in the United States, where children were forcibly taken from their families and put into these Indian boarding schools, where they were forbidden from having indigenous names or wearing their hairs in native styles or wearing native clothes. They were forced to speak English. So that was an example of like forced assimilation. And assimilation as a demand has sometimes been used as a condition of citizenship. So in the case of Native Americans prior to 1924, they individually had to petition for citizenship, and you have to go and make your case for why you should be a citizen. And assimilation could count against you. If you were perceived to not be assimilated, you could not get citizenship. So it is a very important concept. And while that isn't today something that is a condition of US citizenship today, it is still used as a way to sort of like ostracize people who are said to not be assimilated or not being assimilated enough. And when I started to think about assimilation and what it meant to me, I was immediately reminded of my experience as a formerly colonized subject in Morocco, which was a French colony from 1912 to 1944. Now, I went to school in the 1970s, and in fact, Madame Brun wasn't my teacher until the 1980s, and she had lived in Morocco for a couple of decades. And she was her presence in Morocco was part of, like, at the time there were these cooperation agreements because Morocco needed to hire a number of teachers, and massive number of teachers, and so they imported teachers from France in certain subjects, French being one of them, obviously. And so she was my French teacher, and I loved her. She was a great teacher. But I was reminded of the fact that Madame Brun, as you said, did not learn Arabic. She spoke French, and so you were in her class, and if, say, your parents wanted to know how you were doing in her subject and they showed up and wanted to talk to her, they had to talk to her in French. She wasn't going to talk to them in Arabic. And she dressed like a French woman, and she basically had like a French life, except that it was in Morocco. And what strikes me about that is that nobody said, wait a minute, this is strange. Why is she not assimilating? Nobody in parliament stood up and gave a fiery speech about these French immigrants who refuse to assimilate to our ways, right? Nobody said that. And the reason that nobody said that is because of the power struggle between Morocco and France, where Morocco, being a former colony, we are supposed to assimilate to them, but they never think to assimilate to us, even in our own country. And so when you think that assimilation is always a power relationship, and you bring that idea, like once I started thinking about that and you bring that idea in the US, then it kind of starts, for me, it starts to make sense in a different way. It's always about power. And then the question becomes, if you want to push against that, is to say, well, what exactly does assimilation mean? Where do you draw the line? Are you saying that somebody is assimilated if they, if they vote, if they pay their taxes, if they serve on juries, if they serve on the military, if they run for Congress? And you find out pretty soon that even if you do actually have a seat in Congress, it doesn't necessarily mean that people consider that you're assimilated. And in fact, you know, as we see in the ongoing war of words between Trump and Ilhan Omar, that's something that does come up. And Trump has said about Muslim Americans that, I quote, there is no assimilation. And so you, at some point you have to wonder, well, what exactly do they mean by that? And because it's not clearly defined and there is not a clear set of demands of what assimilation means, it's very clear that it becomes a discretionary tool that is wielded by the powerful in order to make sure that people who are kind of on the fringes of belonging are kind of brought in or brought out at will. You know, all you have to say is this person is not assimilated, and then they no longer are an equal citizen. So it is something that is very, that can be used as both as a measure of belonging and as a discretionary tool to exclude people from belonging in the United States. And in that chapter, I also talk a little bit about what the experience of immigration means to me. You know, I am by all accounts somebody that people might consider assimilated, right? But I don't think of it as a question of dress or language or any of that. To me, it's something, like I said earlier, really is about power. And one of the things that happened when I wrote this book is that people said, well, what is it that you have to complain about? Right? Because
it's not a complaint.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. It's a critique. There is a difference between a critique and a complaint. And that is what this chapter talks about, which is that when you immigrate, even when it is under the best of circumstances and you don't have complaints on a personal level, that doesn't mean that the experience is not in itself painful. Like you do in leaving behind another country and adopting another one, there is a like I call it like this invisible scar that you carry with you because you are in this place but you are not of it, right? And so you're kind of, no matter what you do, you are always going to be sort of, you know, perceived as a foreigner. And that becomes clear when you decide to write a book and critique American citizenship.
I mean, that makes me think of something that Hannah Arendt wrote in We Refugees, which is one of my favorite essays, and when I read a lot, I reread a lot, where she's talking about what the refugee loses when they come to the United States, even if they're in the, you know, best of all possible conditions.
Exactly.
And she talks about the death of spontaneity, that you can, you know, when you're not speaking your own language, right, you can no longer be spontaneous. She talks about like the web of sort of connections and understanding and the displacement and the uprootedness of that. And you know, I wrote my last book, my amazing and brilliant co-writer lived as a while as a refugee in Turkey, though he's fortunately been able to return home to Raqqa. And he would often talk about that, the sense of like adriftness and displacement of being uprooted from not just the language, but the web of understandings that he grew up in. I also, so I'm from New York, and I don't mean to glorify New York because New York has so many terrible things, including our president. You know, this is not like a pay on to New York, but one of the good things about my city is anyone can be a New Yorker. You do not have to speak English. You don't have to, you know, dress American. I don't even know what that means. But you don't have to talk a certain way. You don't have to look a certain way. There's none of that sort of, you know, are you or are you not real American? As long as you're kind of like a sharp hustler, you are a New Yorker. And there are also people who have been in America for 400 years who, when they come to New York, are clearly not New Yorkers. They're just Becky from Connecticut, and they will never assimilate. And we judge them sharply too. So one of the parts that I really loved about your book and that really resonated with me is you talk a lot about the gray zone or living in the gray. This term comes from an essay that was in Dabiq, which was the ISIS English language propaganda rag, which was about destroying the gray zone for Muslims living in the West, so that they either had to, you know, join ISIS or, I don't know, join the evil crusader Kufar. And you talk about how in actuality, most people's lives are lived in the gray zone, right? Like your life, as a Moroccan woman who studied in French schools is lived in the gray zone. My life as, a Jewish Puerto Rican woman living in New York is lived in the gray zone. We do not actually have bounded identities. That is just a lie.
Yeah.
And yet, more and more authorities, they want to shove us into those. So tell me more about the gray zone and why that's so important.
Yeah, I also want to explain to viewers that I don't ordinarily make it a habit to check out ISIS propaganda magazines. I was researching the ISIS magazines for a piece for the New York Times Magazine, and that's when I came across this incredible term, the gray zone, and that is something that they came up with, ISIS came up with. They divide the world into two camps, black and white, and then they are after the Muslims who live in the gray zone, the coexistence camp, and they actually are targeting Muslims who live in that camp because they want them to pick one side or another. And as you said so beautifully, identity doesn't work that way. Even though we live in a time in which we are supposed to be only the one thing, like everybody's like, we are constantly being bombarded with this rhetoric of like, it's very divisive, but it's supposed to be where you pick like one side and not the other. And most of our lives are not like that. Like we contain multitudes, right? So when I look at like the kinds of things that I identify with, right? So like you can identify as a citizen in the voting booth. When I walk into a classroom, I'm a professor and educator. At home, I'm a mother, like I'm a woman, or, I'm an Arab, or I'm a Muslim. So I have like a bazillion identities, and each of these identities is activated depending on the context that you're in and depending on the life that you lead. And they are not in conflict with one another. They coexist one on top of the other. They're not necessarily in conflict with one another. And I feel like right now, oftentimes you see people wanting you to choose one side and then reject all the others. And that's usually a sign of like extremism. And what ISIS is saying is you have to choose your Muslim identity over all others, over your racial identity, your cultural identity, your linguistic identity, your ethnic identity. None of these things matter. The only thing that matters is whether you believe the same thing as them. And if you do, then you destroy everything else that is not that thing. You have to destroy it because it doesn't matter. And that is a rhetoric, unfortunately, that you also see here, and you see it in the mouths of some of our leaders, including most famously George W. Bush, right? Like you're either with us or you're against us. And I think that's a very it's such a dangerous way of approaching identity, and I think it's actually on the rise. It's something that people increasingly are being asked to pick one identity over others.
And very simplistic understandings of identity too, as if there is only one way to be an Arab, one way to be a Jew, one way to be a Muslim, which is the way that like this judgy person or group is defining it, which is obviously totally false. The ways to be an Arab or a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian or anything is as varied as the humans.
Let me give you an example. This is not in the book, but this is just like drawn from like real life. My brother-in-law is an OBGYN, and I remember one time he told me that he had somebody he was consulting with, and he wanted to shake hands, and the lady said, "I'm sorry, I don't shake hands. I'm Muslim." He goes, "Oh, okay. Well, my sister-in-law is Muslim, and she shakes my hand all the time." And you know what they said?
What?
She's like, "Oh, she's not really Muslim." So you can see how like this very narrow definition of what it means. And there's really a certain belief that if you do not like believe in this very narrow definition of what it means to be a woman, or if you don't have this very narrow definition of what it means to be an Arab or a Muslim or American, then you're not that thing. And that's, I find very disturbing. And I think it's very, it's actually becoming more, popular in an odd way, and so at least in the media.
No, I agree with you. I mean, when I was growing up, so like my dad's Puerto Rican, he's Puerto Rican studies professor. And always when I was growing up, people would say like, you don't seem Puerto Rican. And I mean, obviously I'm pale, but it wasn't just because of that. It was like, they basically had, I don't know, like some like J-Lo meets Rita Moreno and West Side Story stereotype. And I was failing to live up to that. And ergo, I was not Puerto Rican, because Puerto Ricans are not nerds. They're not bookish. They don't read at all. I don't know. They dance salsa all the time, according to whoever was like judging me. And it actually like did a lot of damage to my head when I was growing up, you know, thinking that I couldn't be this just because, you know, I liked to read, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that increasingly people really are resorting to very essentialized understandings of themselves and each other, both, you know, as a repressive mechanism like the state is doing, but a defensive mechanism as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about that seems really relevant, because we're trapped in our Zoom boxes here and not, you know, sipping wine in a bookstore, is what's it like to read this book during the age of COVID, when all of the borders are being retrenched, when there are new borders, when our stupid American passports are worthless because no one wants us in their countries because we're going to give them COVID, and when we're all kind of stuck, you know, in one place. Like, how does it feel to read this paean to hybridity and cosmopolitanism and complicated identities in free movement at this time when we're so damn stuck? And what do you see like as a, I don't know, a good post-COVID future? I know, right? Yeah, easy questions.
So I finished writing this book exactly a year ago. I think I finished the copy edits in September because by October I already had the ARCs. So this book is like a year old now that I'm actually talking about it to the public. And in it, there is a chapter called Borders. And in Borders, I talk about being stopped by at a border patrol checkpoint, you know, where they ask you, are you a US citizen or not? And then you know, proceed or not. And if not, then you get secondary search and all of that. So I talk about the whole process of internal borders in the US. And the chapter ends, it talks about how borders have sort of multiplied and have become huge business, and they've multiplied all over the world, not just in the US with the wall, but also you know, in Europe, in Turkey, and in other places. And the chapter ends with this sentence: as governments around the world continue to erect more border walls, this is another message worth apprehending. Walls do not simply keep others out, they also keep us in. And then, of course, you know, the book, I turned it in. I had no idea what would happen. And then in March, the book was supposed to come out in April. And then in March, the pandemic started, and my publisher decided to delay the publication until September. And then I watched as, you know, our borders now are not necessarily closed, but nobody wants to come here. Well, the southern border is essentially closed, but the air border is not. And then people don't want to come here because why would they, right? Because of the rates of COVID here. And so it's been a little bit frightening to see some of the things that I write about in a way almost come true. Like you write about it as a warning. I write also a little bit about climate change and how, you know, what's going to happen to us when everything is on fire. And now, of course, you know, well, today actually the air quality is not so bad, but yesterday we couldn't. When COVID happened, it was really sobering to see a lot of these divisions that I write about in the book actually become exacerbated by the presence of this virus. So for example, something like the obscene rate of incarceration that we have in this country. When COVID struck, of course, we see that a lot of the biggest clusters are in detention facilities and prisons. If you look at the treatment at borders, I just started talking about the borders chapter, and you look at detention facilities, that's another big set of clusters of cases. So it really, COVID has exacerbated a lot of the issues that I talk about in the book, in the sense that now when I look at it, it seems I couldn't have anticipated the pandemic, but everything that the book essentially warns about is here. And that's quite sobering. As far as what I predict will happen next.
I know, a fool's game, right, to do that.
Yeah.
But if you have to.
I think that what COVID has done is accelerated trends that were already existing within American society. So right now, if you are able to work from home, and if you can afford to stay at home and not have to go anywhere, then you're essentially protected. And people who don't have those privileges are now basically at much higher risk of infection. Those class divisions already existed before COVID. It's just that COVID made them worse. And I think that unless we address the virus, these kinds of inequities are actually going to continue to speed up. We know what needs to happen because we've seen it with other countries that have managed to get COVID under control. We need massive testing, and not everybody can get that done unless we have massive and rapid testing. We're not going to be able to get the virus under control. We could be waiting for the vaccine, but who knows when the vaccine will come? And even if it's here, who knows who will take it? So testing really is what we should be doing. And instead of like focusing on that, it just seems like it's become impossible to do that. I don't know. It's like the focus now is like, let's reopen, but let's reopen schools, but have this and do that and do that. And there's a saying in Moroccan Arabic that goes something like, where's your ear? Oh, here it is. It's like, and that's what's happening, where we're trying to like get to this part of COVID when we know that there is maybe probably a simpler part to handling it, which is to really try and get the people who are infected isolated as quickly as possible so we can all go back to normal. And we don't know because there's so many asymptomatic carriers. So without actually having massive testing, I don't know how there's going to be a way out of it. So that's why it's a fool's game to try and predict, because it's going to depend on how the crisis is managed. And unfortunately right now it's not managed, it's mismanaged and mishandled and miss everything.
And I mean, one of the things to me that's most menacing is COVID is causing the complete destruction of the American, what I want to call it like petty bourgeoisie, but that sounds like a mean way to put it. I mean, like the small businesses and even the small landlords. It's basically making American capitalism sort of morph into American feudalism, and in the process,
Correct.
destroying all of the gray zones that like a lot of immigrants, a lot of, marginalized people live in. In New York, for instance, the plan for small businesses was just run through your savings until you go bankrupt.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And the way in which the funds, the stimulus funds were disbursed is a great example of that, where massive amounts of money, massive amounts of taxpayer money was given to corporations, was given to airlines, cruise industry. Well, the cruise industry actually didn't get anything, but the airlines and hotels and all of these big businesses got them. And the small, and the research has borne this. Like we've seen this in the research. A lot of the people who have the small, tiny businesses have had a hard time getting through the application process, getting through to their banks, and getting the money. And so it is very difficult for smaller businesses, and that's why the inequities are going to continue. Like that's what you said when you said that the petit bourgeoisie is going.
Yeah.
Because like the differences between the uber rich and everybody else are just going to continue to widen. Yeah, I when I take walks around the neighborhood, I see some of the small businesses and who are just struggling because every day there's a new directive. Today we're opening this way, and then no, actually having this many customers in, or that many customers in, and it's just very difficult on an everyday basis to run a business if you can't plan for any of this. So they're struggling. It's very hard, very hard.
Yeah, we're all going to be serfs for Amazon soon. So
That's why everybody who's listening should be ordering books from Politics and Prose and not from Amazon, which has not paid any taxes.
Yeah, no Amazon, Politics and Prose, man. So I'm looking at the time, and I think we should be opening the floor to questions. So if Politics and Prose, or Oh, there are questions already there. So I'm gonna read you these questions, Laila, and you can tell the audience what they're interested in. What did you find to be the biggest challenge in writing this particular book? Also, thank you so much for doing this, from Meg.
Oh, that's sweet. The biggest challenge in writing this book, I think for me is, so I've written 4 previous books and they were all novels. So the materials that I work with it's all like work of imagination. So you can just take a situation, you create a world in miniature and you're totally in control of it as a writer, right? You can create characters, you can kill characters, you can change the setting, you can do anything. You're in complete control of this miniature world that you've created. In writing nonfiction, the materials are very different because you're working with real events and with facts. And the characters are actual people. There's not like, made up characters. So the biggest challenge for me was just the fact that I was dealing with slightly different materials and at a greater length. Like I've written a lot of nonfiction, a lot, but most of it, so I've written a lot of book criticism, I've written cultural commentary, op-eds, columns, but most of the length of that is, I would say, anywhere between 1,000 and 8,000 words. And, obviously when you work on a book, it's a much larger canvas. So that's the second challenge, is how to sort of just maintain the sort of momentum in the book. In a novel, it was like, beginning, middle, and end, and you have a plot. And then, with a nonfiction book, it's like finding a sort of organizing principle for the book that kind of can sustain me through the writing process. And for me, the organizing principle was that I would begin with my citizenship ceremony, which happened in 2000. And then from there, just look at different lenses. Like my experiences is what I use to open each chapter, but then kind of like pull away from that to talk about the experiences of other people. And I would say that while the materials are different because it's factual and drawn from real life, the goal hopefully is the same, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. What you're aiming at is to write the truth, or at least the truth in how you're able to see it in your own limited perspective. So I would say the goal is the same, the materials are different, and the process is also a little bit different.
This one is from anonymous attendee. Despite the unreasonable challenges of assimilating and gaining all the privileges of citizenship in the US, why do you think people keep coming and working hard to stay here?
I think that's a very reasonable question, Anonymous. I think that I would say my answer is that the American dream is a very seductive notion, and I think that it has a great deal of power around the world. It is something that people are exposed to outside the United States through films and television series. This idea that if wherever you come from, if you work hard, you can be successful in the United States. And a lot of people believe in this idea, which is a very seductive, egalitarian idea. But I think that once here, then we have to look at what exactly is the outcome of this belief. And in terms of something like measures of social mobility, the United States is actually not at the top of how fast immigrants can go who have come here with nothing to get to the top. This isn't to say that there are not immigrants who are hugely successful. I mean, look who's running Google, for example. We're not talking about individual data points or individual immigrants who have succeeded, but if you look at data trends, like if you look at groups of people and who succeeds, it's very much dependent on a number of factors, including the field in which they're working in, whether it's tech or whether it's something else, and depending on the city in which they're in, depending on a lot of factors that are not necessarily under their control. I also would like to point out that within the United States, one of the largest predictors of your economic success is the zip code in which you were born. And so you know, even if you put in a lot of individual effort, you are still constrained by something as simple as where you're from. And that means the range of options that are available to you as you grow up make it so that that can be a barriers to success. So I would say in conclusion that the idea is seductive, and the reality is something that the data tells us isn't quite as seductive.
This one is from Abiola Johnson. Thank you for writing this very important book. What are your thoughts on the tokenism behind highlighting and celebrating Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month during certain times of the year? And what does this say about the American experience? And how does it invalidate Americans calling this country a melting pot when we should be celebrating our cultures all year round? There is, after all, no White History Month.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tokenism is a huge, it basically reflects an understanding of diversity that is, if we have one of whatever that thing is, then we have done our jobs, pats ourselves on the back, we have been inclusive, and we have diversified. And as you, your question suggests, that isn't nearly enough. I think that the issue with something like Black History Month is that while it is helpful in educating people about the contributions of Black Americans, what it doesn't do is place them within the larger context of American history. We have to have that kind of history taught year round, right? It's not as if we have a White History Month and a Black History Month and a Hispanic History Month. We don't, I mean, all of these histories have to be taught together rather than separately. And what was the second part of the question?
How does this invalidate the Americans calling this country a melting pot?
Oh, that is a very valid point, because if it were a melting pot, then everybody's histories would be taught at the same time. The idea of the melting pot is really interesting. I talk about it a little bit in the assimilation chapter in the book. And one of the things I mentioned is how throughout its history, the US has basically paid a lot of lip service to the idea of the melting pot, while at the same time, working to exclude certain communities. So if you look at the history of immigration, you get something like the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, all these myths of a nation of immigrants. But when you look at the actual history, you have immigration laws that for the majority of US history have prevented non-white Americans from immigrating to this country. And you have laws that were specifically designed to keep certain undesirables out of the country, quote unquote undesirables out of this country, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which Molly mentioned earlier, of 1882, and other laws like the Immigration Act of 1924, which all but shuttered the doors of the United States to anybody that was not from Western Europe. So there is this bizarre contradiction at the heart of American history, again, with the sort of embracing with one arm and rejecting with the other. And so even tokenism is an expression of that, because it's basically saying, well, you get to be a part of American history, but here's the lane, and this is where this is where you belong, and this is where the teaching will be. And it's hard. And I have to say that even within sort of like the literary world, you see it all the time. You see it in, you know, literary magazines and what they publish, where you have like, okay, there's this one Nigerian author, that's it, no other Nigerian authors. And, you know, so that it does exist everywhere throughout society.
The next question is from Edward Iwara. As we become a majority minority nation, how will our ideas of cultural identity and community change beyond the bounded identities and narrow definitions that you mentioned? Do you see marginalized folks breaking boundaries and joining forces to build new kinds of cross-cultural identities and communities?
Well, my hope with this book is that by connecting the dots between the experiences of different kinds of communities within the states, that it is going to create bonds of solidarity between these different communities, and to define American in a way that is American, in a way that is more inclusive rather than exclusive, in a way that guarantees us equal citizenship rather than conditional citizenship. And certainly cultural identity is a part of that, but I do think that culture is something that is enriched by mixing. it's not something that's made impoverished by mixing. It's something that's made enriched by it. So the thing is that we can't depend. Yes, we know that it is going to be a minority nation, but it's not something that I would say. I think there's going to be. I think we are living, in fact, through a huge backlash against that, and that's why we're essentially heading into a situation in which a minority is actually ruling the country, regardless of what the majority wants. We are in that moment right now, right? So the person who's occupying the White House, for example, has not won the popular vote. In fact, his party has not won the popular vote for a long time, and yet look at all of the power that that party has. So I don't think that it's just a question of what the demographics tell us, but what the power within American society, whether that power is actually reflective of the will of the majority. That's the question. That I don't know.
This question is from Samira. As Arab Americans, we feel muzzled whenever we make an opinion about American interventions in the Middle East. Can you please tell us if you felt muzzled at certain times, for example, on campus or with friends?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I teach creative writing at the University of California at Riverside. I'm trying to think now. Because I teach creative writing, all of my work is out there for everybody to see. It's both fiction and nonfiction is available online, a lot of it. Muzzled by the university, not necessarily, because one of the great things about being an academic is that, unlike other lines of work, it is one that at least in principle guarantees academic freedom. But just because I personally have not been targeted by it doesn't mean that that's true of other people. So we all know the case of somebody like, off the top of my head, Steven Salaita a few years ago, who lost his job because of a tweet that he had posted. So it's not, it is absolutely a concern in academia. Academic freedom is, and it's something that I haven't experienced, but doesn't mean is very real. And I think, and as you know, there are many examples of that. What was the second part of the question?
If you felt muzzled, like with friends.
With friends. Oh, that's interesting. With friends, I would say that it just depends. Not really. I would say it depends on the friend. And I don't I don't think of myself as a sort of a muzzleable person. But I will say that there are issues that, when you talk about them, people react very differently. And sometimes somebody that you think is very liberal or that you think shares the same views as you start talking about Israel, and then suddenly you discover that maybe they don't actually have the same views. So it definitely does happen, but I wouldn't say that it stops me from saying what I think.
So I think this is going to be the last question, and it is from Ismi Thames. Thanks so much for this fascinating discussion. I'd love to hear more about how conditionality is negotiated. It seems not always, or not only, the most powerful who exert it, but also people somewhere on the ladder fearing loss of status. Put differently, could loyalty become determined by those who actually fear their loyalty may be contested? How do we deal with that?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really, really great question, and it's something that historically we have seen in the US, where a recently quote unquote assimilated immigrant group becomes sort of involved in denying a more recently arrived immigrant group access to some of the rights and privileges of citizenship. So you see that. I think that you're right. Like everything else, conditionality is not an either or concept. It's something that exists on a spectrum. And I think that it's absolutely true that it can be wielded by people who feel that by calling others' allegiance into question, that in some way it affirms their own allegiance. Do you know what I mean? And that is, it is absolutely true. And thank you for bringing this actually to my attention. It's something that I will be sure to include in other talks also. I think that's a really valid point. So I agree.
So I think there's our lovely moderator from Politics and Prose back up. This was such a total pleasure and honor to get to discuss your book with you, Laila. And Politics and Prose, thank you so much for having me. This was really a real treat.
Thank you both so much for this wonderful hour. Everything is so hard right now, but it was really, really strengthening to listen to the two of you talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly, for doing this. And thank you, Politics and Prose, for hosting.
Stay well read and buy the book.
Yes, thanks. From Politics and Prose.
Yeah, not Amazon.
Maybe. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Bye, everyone. Good night.